Unlike the Lord of the Rings movies that remain quite faithful to the books, with only a few changes that stay well within what one would expect in an adaptation, the Rings of Power show from Amazon is so far removed from the source material, it may as well be an entirely different world. The first season of the Rings of Power is set during the Second Age of Middle-earth, covering events prior to the Lord of the Rings trilogy we know and love. Over the course of the season, we see Valinor, the homeland of the Elves, Lindon, the elven realm in the furthest west of Middle-earth, and we even get to see Mount Doom again. In addition, we see Numenor, the home of Aragorn's ancestors, the Mines of Moria when it was a palace, and finally we see the forging of the 3 rings for the Elven kings under the sky. Unfortunately, besides the nomenclature, like the names of places, most characters, some one-off comments about past events, and of course, the fact that 3 rings were indeed made, it's as accurate as Rings of Power gets. So if Galadriel didn't scour Middle-earth for thousands of years searching for Sauron to avenge her brother and fulfill some oath, and the elves weren't concerned about stealing Mithril because the ore has magical powers that can save them from a made-up affliction that causes them to fade into bodiless spirits, and the Numenorians didn't sail to Middle-earth to fight some random made-up bad guy, then what actually happened in the Rings of Power? In the very first episode of Rings of Power, it's briefly mentioned that the Second Age began with the defeat of the evil Valar Morgoth. Sauron, his trusted lieutenant, survived. He even repented of all his evil deeds, probably even truthfully at first. But when it came to returning to Valinor for his judgment, his shame and humiliation overcame him, and he hardened his heart, hiding himself in Middle-earth and falling back into evil. In the first year of the Second Age, the Elves established the Grey Havens and Lindon. A few years later, the dwarves go to Moria, and the western lands of Middle-earth experience a long period of peace, where evil is really only found in the Southlands, where men who still held to Morgoth and Sauron's evil ways dwell. Fast forward to the 500th year of the Second Age, Sauron begins to stir again, venturing out from his hiding place. As he went about Middle-earth, he found most of it still desolate after the end of the First Age, where the face of Middle-earth changed in a great upheaval. He used this to fuel his hatred for the Valar, thinking they had forsaken Middle-earth, and with that thought, the desire to rule over all of Middle-earth then began to take hold in his heart. In the 750th year of the Second Age, the Elves established a region next to Moria, since Mithril had been found in the mine. At this time, a great friendship arose between dwarves and elves, and it isn't until the 1000th year that Sauron, alarmed at the growing power of the Numenorians, who had really just begun to establish permanent cities in Middle-earth, chooses Mordor to be his home and begins building the Dark Tower, Barad-dûr. 200 years later, in the 1200th year of the Second Age, Sauron takes on the form of a fair, beautiful elf and calls himself Annatar, Lord of Gifts. Even though he could easily bring the race of men under his power, he truly desired to dominate and control the elves, since they were the more powerful race. So he first tries treating with Lindon, the epicenter of elvendom in Middle-earth at the time, but the High King Gil-galad and Elrond mistrusted him and his fair-seeming form and wouldn't let him come to the land, even though they didn't know who he really was. Undaunted, Sauron travels to Eregion, where, through his power of persuasion, cunning, and profound wisdom, he appeals to the elves' love for Middle-earth, pitting them against the elves of Lindon, saying, "Why haven't they helped Middle-earth's desolation, while Lindon is so splendid?" And he manages to convince them to accept him. But most of all, the elven smiths in Eregion were hungry for knowledge and continually looked for ways to improve their skill and subtlety in their craft. Of this, Sauron had much wisdom to offer. So the elves of Eregion welcomed Sauron, and under his wise tutelage, surpassed all that they had made before, and they started to make rings of power. This happens in the 1500th year of the Second Age. All the Rings of Power were made under Sauron's guidance, and because of that, he was aware of all that the elves did and desired even more to place a bond over the elves, to bring them under his power and influence. So in the year 1600, Sauron forged the One Ring in Mount Doom. He had to pour much of his own strength and will into the One Ring to overcome the very great power of the other rings the elves crafted. Because of that, all the other rings of power made before it were subject to the One. While he wore the One Ring, he could see all the things that were done with the lesser rings, and he could even see and command the very thoughts of those that wore them. With the forging of the One Ring, Sauron's trap for the elves was sprung. He finally would be able to enslave the elves and rule Middle-earth. At the same time, though, secretly Celebrimbor forged the 3 rings we see in the Rings of Power and in the Lord of the Rings. Since Celebrimbor alone forged them, they remained uncorrupted from Sauron's power. However, even these rings were still subject to the One. There are more events in the Second Age, not the least of which we see in the very beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, where the last alliance of elves and men battle Sauron himself at the feet of Mount Doom. But since the Rings of Power Season 1 ends with the forging of the 3 elven rings, I'll stop the tale here. But what about the Numenorians? I hardly mentioned them in the telling of the actual events of the Second Age. And that's just it. They definitely play a large part in the Second Age, but their dealings with Sauron aren't until over 100 years after the forging of the Rings of Power. The Numenorians become prominent in the story after Sauron wages war against the elves, after Eregion is laid to waste, after Celebrimbor is slain and the gates of Moria are shut, and after the founding of Rivendell. At the time of the events of the first season of the Rings of Power, the friendship between the Numenorians and the Elves is still strong, and the Numenorians still hold the Valar and the Eldar in high regard. Later in the year 1700, the Numenorian king at the time even sent aid to Lindon, which was being assaulted by Sauron's forces. They helped the elves defeat Sauron, pushing him back to Mordor, giving the Westlands peace for a while. What we see in the Rings of Power with Pharazôn happens over 1500 years later, when Pharazôn forces Miriel to marry him, and he becomes king instead of her. Miriel's father, Tar Palantir, did indeed repent of the turning away of the Numenorians from the Valar, but with Pharazôn, they went right back to spurning the Valar. There's a lot more lore around the Numenorians too, but again, I'm keeping it as best as I can to what the show has covered. Lastly, I do want to address a few egregious departures from the lore. First, the entire plotline with Galadriel and how she is portrayed is not only made up, but a huge departure from the character of Galadriel in the lore. She has a bit of a defiant streak, which we see when the Noldor elves defy the Valar and go to Middle-earth, and again when she refuses to return twice to Valinor. And no, she didn't try to swim across an entire ocean on one of those occasions. She's actually more like how she's depicted in the Lord of the Rings movies, caring for the problems of Middle-earth, but pretty above all of them. She's powerful, wise, perceptive, and can see into people's minds and discern their intentions. She stays with her husband, Celeborn, who also is a great lord of elves, and isn't dead or thought to be, because she loves him so much. The elves regard her with honor, and she acts her age. She isn't an impulsive, callous, warmongering elf traversing Middle-earth for 1,000 years to find Sauron in order to avenge her brother on an oath that also isn't lore accurate. Speaking of her brother, though he only shows up in a few scenes, those few scenes go a long way to portray his character in the lore. The last we see of Finrod alive, he's crying and hugging orcs. This is the exact opposite of Finrod in the lore. He is powerful, revered, awesome. Though he was indeed captured by Sauron, he died saving Beren, yes, of Beren and Luthien, after bursting out of his bonds, wrestling a massive werewolf and killing it with his bare hands and teeth. He died fulfilling an oath of service, not failing an oath of revenge. Another egregious departure from the lore is the depiction of Celebrimbor. Trying to be as charitable as possible, the scene with Sauron and Celebrimbor discussing how to use the small amount of mithril, I think, is supposed to be seen as Sauron imparting his great wisdom to Celebrimbor. He even ends the scene with this line,
"Call it a gift,"
which is a reference to his alias, Anatar, Lord of Gifts. However, Celebrimbor was the grandson of Fëanor. Fëanor was the greatest smith of all time and created jewels that captured the light of the two trees called the Silmarils. Celebrimbor, after Fëanor died, was the greatest smith alive. Sauron's great wisdom was telling Celebrimbor about alloys? Yeah, it's a portrayal of the character of Celebrimbor in the lore, and instead of a great powerful smith, he looks like a foolish old man. Lastly, we see in the Rings of Power that the Numenorians' hatred of elves is founded on their fear that the elves would come to their island and take all their jobs since they don't tire easily or die or get sick. This is egregious because not only did the Numenorians not fear that, but in fact they became so powerful that they thought themselves equal to the elves. And because of that, they envied the elves' immortality and began to question the gift of mortality from Ilúvatar. They begrudged the elves' right to go to Valinor and live forever. When they were banned from sailing so far west, they'd lose sight of the island of Numenor. Their envy of the immortality of elves is what drove the wedge between the Numenorians and the elves, and is eventually what led them to their downfall. Additionally, I must make a few last honorable mentions. First, Mithril having some magical powers to cure some made-up disease that plagued the elves. It's just a super strong, pretty metal. Second, the entire plot of the Southlands with the made-up characters of Bronwyn, Arendir, and Adar, for the fact that their characters and the events involving them aren't in the lore. And lastly, for that same reason, the other made-up characters like Isildur's sister, Disa, these things, and the entire Harfoot plotline. The Harfoots are all but a footnote in the lore. The Rings of Power lore accuracy is not its strong suit. It's not even like the Lord of the Rings movies, which also depart from the lore in some areas, but still manage to keep not only the spirit of Tolkien, but many word-for-word lines from the books, almost all the same events, and keep the characters consistent with how they are portrayed in the books. The Rings of Power doesn't even get close to that. Most of the events that are actually lore accurate happen over many more years. The characters like Galadriel and Celebrimbor are completely different, and the Numenorians really don't enter the picture until after the Three Rings are made. As someone who loves the world Tolkien meticulously crafted over nearly his lifetime, it's hard to see anything but a complete disrespect for the source material and, therefore, its creator. Indeed, Season 1 of the Rings of Power show is truly Lord of the Rings in name only.